The day your last child left, you probably smiled and said you were fine. But later, in the quiet of a house that had never felt so large, something happened that you didn't have a word for. Think about that first ordinary morning after, when you made coffee and realized you had made too much, when the house held a silence that was different from any silence you had known before. Not peaceful, not restful, just vast. And yours in a way you had not asked for and were not sure you wanted. You had told yourself you were ready, but nothing had prepared you for the specific weight of that particular quiet. And what made it harder, no one around you seemed to think it was serious enough to sit with. They said you should be proud. They asked about your plans. No one asked how you actually were, in the place beneath the smile. Yet in the room where the feeling lived that you still could not name. What you were feeling was not weakness. It was not ingratitude. It has a name, and naming it correctly changes everything. Psychology calls it role exit. Buddhist teaching calls it the natural suffering of attachment to impermanence. And monks of all people, those who chose this kind of silence deliberately, have known something about it for thousands of years that most of us in the noise of ordinary life never get the chance to discover. Today, I want to offer you three things: what you are actually grieving because it is not what you think, what monks have always understood about the gift hidden inside an empty room, and who you are now underneath the role that has changed, because the answer may be the most interesting discovery of your entire life. But before we talk about what the season is asking of you, we need to be honest about what it has already taken, because the grief is real. It deserves to be named before it can be released. That is exactly where we begin. 1. The grief nobody names. When was the last time you felt truly alone? Not just physically alone, but alone in a way that makes you wonder whether anyone around you understands what is actually happening inside you. That feeling has a name, and more importantly, it has a reason. Here is what no one tells you. The grief you are feeling is not because you love your children too much. It is not because you are too attached or unable to let go. What is actually happening is this. You spent decades building an identity around a role, and that role has not ended. It has been completed, and nobody prepared you for the difference, because they feel the same from the inside, but they mean something entirely different. There are three things you are grieving right now. Most people only recognize the first. The first is the physical presence, the noise. Mars, the particular chaos of a house being lived in by people who need things from you. That grief is obvious and allowed. The second is the structure. For decades, your days had a shape. Someone needed breakfast. Someone needed to be driven. Someone needed you. And now the days are shapeless in a way that feels less like freedom and more like standing in a very large room with no furniture and no idea which direction is out. The third is the deepest and the least named. You are grieving a version of yourself that only existed in relation to them. The person they only called by that name and that voice with that need behind it. And when they left, that version of you became uncertain, undefined. And that uncertainty is the grief people rarely admit because it sounds like a confession of having lived wrongly. It is not. One, it is a confession of having lived fully inside a role that was worthy of everything you gave it. Buddhist teaching offers something honest here. It does not ask you to reframe or find the silver lining. It simply says what you are experiencing is the natural consequence of loving something impermanent. And impermanence is not a flaw in the design, it is the design. Children are meant to leave. Roles are meant to be completed. The suffering is not a sign that something went wrong. It is a sign that something mattered deeply enough to hurt when its shape changed. The Buddha spoke of the second arrow. The first arrow is the pain itself, unavoidable. The second arrow is what we add to it, the shame of feeling it, the belief that a good parent should feel only pride at this moment, not grief. And most of the suffering in an empty nest comes from the second arrow, not the first. You are allowed to feel the loss. That is not a weakness. That is honesty. Tonight, sit in the quiet without filling it. No television, no phone. Just sit and ask yourself which of the three things you are grieving most right now. Just naming it changes something. Because a grief with a name is a grief you can begin to move through. A grief without a name tends to move through you instead. The grief is real and it is legitimate. But here is where something unexpected enters the story. Because of the silence that feels so strange right now, the monks have been choosing it deliberately for thousands of years. And what they have found inside it is something most of us, in the noise of ordinary life, never get the chance to discover. Well, that is exactly where we go next. 2. What monks know about empty rooms. For thousands of years, men and women have walked away from everything that defined them. Family, status, comfort, noise, and entered a silence that most people would call unbearable. But what they found there was not emptiness. It was the first honest conversation they had ever had with themselves. We tend to look at monks and think they are escaping life. But the great monastic traditions of the world teach something almost opposite. The silence is not an escape. It is a confrontation. When you remove all the noise, all the roles, all the things that tell you who you are from the outside, what remains is nothing. It is you, possibly for the first time, unfiltered by anyone else's need. This is exactly what the empty nest is offering you right now, not by your choice, perhaps, but the invitation is the same. Zen master Shunryu Suzuki wrote something that has stayed with me for years. He said, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." You have been an expert for 30 years, an expert parent, an expert caregiver, an expert at reading what others need before they have finished asking. That expertise is real, and it is valuable, and it costs you something significant to build. But expertise by its nature narrows. It knows what to do before it has even finished listening. And the beginner's mind, which is what this season is quietly asking you to recover, is wide open. It does not know yet. And not knowing in Zen is not a problem. It is a doorway. Buddhist teaching on renunciation is often misunderstood. People hear renunciation and think deprivation, think loss. Think giving up something you love. But in its deeper meaning, renunciation is simply this: releasing your grip on what has already changed shape. Not because it did not matter, because it mattered completely, and it has now been completed, and holding the shape of a thing that has changed is not loyalty. It is suffering. The monks did not choose silence because they had nothing to love. Many of them had everything. They chose silence because they discovered that inside the silence was something that the noise of ordinary life, however beautiful and full, could never fully reveal. A kind of knowing that only comes when you stop being defined by what others need you to be. I once knew a man named David, 64 years old, who lost his career and his last child in the same year. He described it as having the outer walls of a building removed and realizing he had never seen what the inside actually looked like. He began sitting in silence each morning, not for spiritual reasons, but simply because he did not know what else to do with the quiet. And after several months, he told me something I have never forgotten. He said, "I found out that I actually like myself. I had no idea. I had never been alone with myself long enough to find out." That is not a small discovery. That is perhaps the most important discovery a person can make. And it tends to arrive, if it arrives at all, in exactly this kind of season. The silence your house is holding right now is not punishment. It is not evidence that your life has contracted. It is the same silence the monks have been entering deliberately for centuries. It's because they know something about it that took them generations to learn, and that I want to offer you now. The silence does not stay empty. If you let it, if you resist the urge to fill it immediately with noise and plans and distraction, it begins to fill on its own. With things you forgot you cared about, with a voice that is entirely your own, with questions that are genuinely interesting rather than urgent, with the beginning of an answer to the question that this whole season has been asking. Most people will fill the silence as quickly as possible. Television, phone calls, anything to avoid sitting alone with the one person they have spent their whole life being too busy to truly know, themselves. But a very few will do something different. They will sit in it, and what they find there will surprise them. This week, we'll spend 15 minutes each morning in complete silence before reaching for your phone or turning on any sound. Not meditating, not trying to achieve anything, simply sitting with yourself. Notice what comes up. That is your interior life, knocking on the door. It has been knocking for a long time. This is the season when you finally have enough quiet to hear it. So the monks deliberately entered the silence and found something extraordinary within it. And your empty nest has brought the silence to you, whether you chose it or not. The question now is not whether to be in the silence. You are already in it. The question is who you discover when you finally stop running from it. That is the most important question of this entire season, and it is exactly where we go next. 3. Who are you now? Somewhere in the years of making lunches and attending games and worrying in the dark, there was a person who had things they wanted to say, things they wanted to feel, things they wanted to become. That person is still there. They have been waiting with extraordinary patience, and they have something to tell you. We were taught that who am I is a question for the young, something that belongs to your 20s, to the restless searching before life settles. But Buddhist teaching says something almost opposite. It says this question, who am I underneath all the roles, underneath all the conditions, underneath everything others have needed me to be, is not a question of youth. It is the question of genuine maturity. And most people never have enough silence to ask it honestly until exactly this season of life. So ask it now. It's not with anxiety, with curiosity. Here is what the silence of an empty nest is actually offering you beneath the grief and beneath the disorientation. It is offering you, perhaps for the first time in decades, an unobstructed view of yourself. Don't be yourself as a parent, not yourself as a caregiver or provider or the person who remembered everyone else's appointments. Just yourself, the interior person, the one with longings and unfinished thoughts that kept getting interrupted by someone who needed something, which was fine, which was right. But now the interruptions have stopped, and the thoughts are still there, exactly where you left them. Buddhist teaching speaks of anatta, often translated as no fixed self. Not that you do not exist, but that you are not the role, you are not the title, you are a living process, each still unfolding, still becoming. And this means something extraordinary. When the role changes, you do not disappear. You become available, available to yourself in a way you have not been for a very long time. The psychologist Erik Erikson identified this stage of life as defined by one essential question: not what will I do with the time I have left, but what will I become in it? Research consistently shows that people who actively explore who they are after a major role ends, who ask the question and let it lead somewhere, report more well-being, more genuine connection, and more sense of purpose than those who either cling to the old role or simply stop asking altogether. I once knew a woman named Ruth, 67 years old, 35 years as a teacher and a mother. When both ended in the same year, she picked up painting, was something she had set a shade at 22 when life required something more practical. She told me, I thought I was going back to something I had lost, but what I found was something I had never fully had, because now I had things to say that I didn't have at 22, decades of things, and the painting knew it before I did. That is not a story about finding a hobby. That is a story about a person discovering that everything she thought was behind her had been quietly building something beneath all the roles. Something more layered, more honest, and more worth exploring than anything she had managed to express when she was young. So let me ask you directly, there are things you set aside, not because you forgot them, because the timing was wrong, because someone needed you, because life moved in a direction that required something else from you. Those things did not disappear. They went quiet. They waited with the same patience you showed everyone else your entire life. You know what they are. You have always known. The old sentence is, I don't know who I am without my children needing me. The new sentence is, for the first time, I get to find out who I am when I am not defined by anyone else's need. And that is not a loss. That is the most interesting question my life has ever asked me. Most people in this season will fill every quiet moment before that question can fully form. They will stay busy, stay needed, stay defined by something external, rather than sit with the uncertainty of not yet knowing. They will never find out what was waiting underneath. Don't let that be you. Wow, the question is already here. You are already in it. Tonight, write down 3 things you always wanted to do, feel, or become. Things you set aside because the timing was never right. Do not edit the list. Do not judge it because that list is not nostalgia. It is not compensation for something lost. It is a map drawn by the person you have been quietly becoming beneath all the roles, through all the years, and every moment you were too busy to notice. That person has been here the entire time. They are here right now, ready if you are willing to turn toward them. The grief has been named. The silence has been entered. The question of who you are now has begun to find its answer. There is only one thing left: to bring everything together and leave you with something true that you can carry when this video ends. Let's finish this together. We have come a long way together today. From the mourning that felt too quiet, to the grief that finally had a name, to the silence the monks have always known, to the person who has been waiting underneath all the roles. And now one last thing, the most important one. The house is not empty, it is spacious. And spacious is something entirely different. Your children did not leave. They graduated. And a graduation is not a loss. It is proof that the work was done well. The silence is not absence. It is the first honest quiet you have had in decades. And the question of who you are now is not a crisis. It is the most interesting question your life has ever asked you. You did not fail the role. You completed it. And completion is not an ending. It is the condition that makes the next beginning possible. Watch, after everything I have studied and every person I have sat with in this particular season of life, I return to this belief every single time. The empty nest is one of the most misnamed experiences in human life. It is not empty. It is full of something we rarely make space for: the uninterrupted presence of ourselves. And that presence, when we finally stop running from it, when we finally sit with it the way the monks have sat with theirs, turns out to be not the thing we feared, but the thing we have been searching for all along. Not a replacement for what was. Something deeper. Something that was always there, patient and quiet, waiting for the noise to finally settle. The grief was real, and it deserved every tear. The silence was strange, and it deserved to be named. Yet, the question of who you are now is not one you need to answer all at once. You have time, perhaps more time, more space, and more permission than you have had at any other point in your adult life. The only question is what you will do with it, whether you will fill it as quickly as possible with anything that makes you feel needed again, or whether you will sit in it long enough to hear what has been trying to speak to you beneath the noise for decades. Somewhere in your house right now, there is a room that used to belong to someone else, and it is quiet. And that quiet is not a wound. It is a room that is finally ready to hold something new, something that belongs entirely to you. not to your role, not to your history, not to what anyone has ever needed you to be. To you, you are not finished. You are spacious. And that is not the same as empty. It never was. If something in this video is named something you have been carrying without a name, please like this video and share it with someone who is in this season and has not yet found the words for what they are feeling, because the feeling is real and it deserves a language. And leave me one comment before you go. What is one thing you set aside years ago that you are now finally ready to return to? I read every single one because you are not done, not even close. The most interesting chapter of your life does not have a title yet, but it is already being written, and it begins right now.